Is this on?
Okay, good evening everybody. I'd like to welcome you, all the people here in the room, as well as the ones that might be listening to the live stream via the internet. My name is Timo Daum. I will be the moderator and host for tonight's closing panel called Digital Democracy and Technological Sovereignty: Left Answers to the Smart Attack of Neoliberalism. After a full day of insights and ideas around algorithms, the growing importance of and for the functioning and the domination through capital of algorithms, we will conclude with a short lecture by Evgeny Morozov, followed by a discussion, quick discussion among the panelists, and then we will open up for you, the audience. Let me quickly introduce this illustrious panel. At least this was the plan, but part of the panel is still sitting in the recreational leisure area. Okay, so we will let them stay there. So I'm going to introduce them afterwards once they appear here on stage. So let me introduce tonight's keynote speaker. I would like to call Evgeny Morozov the spoilsport of the internet hype. In his numerous articles, and especially in his two books, The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom, and To Save Everything, Click Here, The Folly of Technological Solutionism, he dismantles the core myths and ideological figures of the digital era. He's a contributing editor. Okay, go to the next sentence. Yeah. Okay, he's currently working on a research project he's going to outline in the upcoming talk. It's a critique of and proposal of alternatives to the concept of the smart city. Please welcome our speaker, Evgeny Morozov.
Now? Better? Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming. I was joking at the beginning that the title of tonight's session has all the possible words in it, from, I think, neoliberalism to left, to sovereignty, to technology, to digital, to smart. So it would be really hard to disappoint you. So we'll talk at least about each of them. I'm not sure if we can cover all of them in just, at least me, in just 20 minutes that I have, but I'll try nonetheless. So let me start with a few hopefully punchy statements that might set the stage for discussion tonight, and hopefully try to create at least some background to understanding why an idea like technological sovereignty is actually worth fighting for and what it actually is. So I'll start from one of the words in the title of our event, which is neoliberalism. Right? I think there is a discussion now after Brexit, certainly after the victory of Trump in the US elections, about the future of neoliberalism. Right? And a lot of people seem to be convinced that neoliberalism is over. We must talk about something called post-neoliberalism, or we must start talking about something completely different. I think that story, in a sense, builds on an earlier diagnosis of its death, if you will, that we heard immediately after the financial crisis, where in years 2008, 2009, there was a very vibrant debate among a lot of economists on the left, politicians, sociologists, about neoliberalism also being that. For me, the most striking image to have come out of that debate is probably that presented by the Marxist geographer Jamie Peck, who said that we are living through the times of zombie neoliberalism, meaning that, you know, it's a creature whose head is dead, but the body is still walking. So, you know, its ideas are no longer appropriate. The ideas are basically empty, but the kind of institutional body still keeps walking. I actually think that that also was premature. I don't think that we are at a stage where we can talk about zombie neoliberalism, because I think it actually functions. But the reason why it's so hard for us to detect its inner functions, if you will, but also understand why it has proved so resilient in the face of many challenges that it encountered is because we are partly looking in the wrong places. We are looking at, I don't know, maybe how governments relate to the financial sector. You know, we look at it and we see a big bailout heading that way, and we think, hey, it means that this logic of the free market that neoliberals preach is no longer applicable, hence neoliberalism must be that. I think it's a very naive view of things. I think the reason why neoliberalism appears that to so many of us is because we're essentially looking in the wrong places. And I think we have to be looking particularly at the intersection between technology, especially digital technology, and cities in order to understand how neoliberalism has adapted to many of the challenges it has encountered in its way. And you know, if you create a somewhat vulgar version of what I've just said, you know, if you really want to understand how neoliberalism works today, you'd better start paying attention not just to Wall Street, but also to Silicon Valley, right? You have to understand that neoliberals, by and large, no longer preoccupy themselves with just thinking about central banks, even though that still constitutes a large part of what they do. But if you actually look at actual economists, rather than just policymakers or intellectuals, and if you look at what they do, you know, a lot of it is very data intensive. A lot of it is things like market design, experimental economics. I mean, this is really the cutting edge of neoliberal practice. A lot of that is very congruent to what is happening in Silicon Valley for the sole reason that Silicon Valley is what produces the data. Right? That is so useful in designing various markets, designing various platforms that then are conducive to markets and marketization of everyday life, and so forth. So this is one point that I would like to sort of put on the table tonight, and it's that we really have to understand how Silicon Valley actually fits within the neoliberal transformation of the world, which I would argue is still continuing. Second point I would like to make is that there is something of a tendency, which of course you see in Germany, but you also see it in much of the rest of the world, to basically label any movement that challenges or questions the standard neoliberal party line as populist, right? You have probably seen it in the media. I mean, I liked particularly a letter that was sent to the editors, I think, of The Economist a few months ago, where they basically said that given how many movements you've labeled as populist in your journal and newspaper, it seems that for you, anything that disagrees with your editorial line is populist. I think we actually have to understand how that definition of populism works, and we also have to understand whether the elements accusing deviance from the party line as populist might be populist themselves. Right? And I don't think that it's oxymoronic to talk about such a thing as populism of the elites. I think there is actually such a thing as populism of the elites, and it operates at three particular plateaus or levels, if you will. And I would argue that those plateaus are finance, and again, technology and the city. I will explain what I mean by that, but I think it's very important to understand that, you know, when the elites accuse a movement or a party of being populist, what they often mean is that they promise things that are unrealistic, or they promise things that appeal to some kind of average Joe on the street, right, with their base instincts and kind of easy manipulability. But if you look at what this populism of the elites promises us, it's ultimately the same. I mean, they promise things that are not realistic by any measure. I would like to say a few words why. And they also appeal to the average Joe in the street, if you will. Right? So the three pillars of modern populism of the elites, the financial one, the urban one, and the technological one, I mean, I can probably spend an hour on each of them. I'll say a few words very briefly about the financial and the urban one, and I'll say a few more words about the technological one, because I think it actually will help us understand what the right counter strategy and counter response would be, and why technological sovereignty might actually help us to grapple with this issue a little bit better. So when I say that the populism of the elites rests on these three foundations, finance, cities, and technology, what I want to say is that if you look at specific expectations that are being placed on each of those three domains, you can clearly see that, you know, finance, for example, right? And you don't need to talk about the basics, that the banks are supposed to be playing a big part in the economy and that, we should basically privatize and financialize everything. I mean, that I kind of take for granted as the sort of background condition of our contemporary debate. But there is a much more sinister, but also kind of let's all save the world rhetoric hiding behind this financial populism. And what it promises us is that basically, as long as we involve the financial sector in running schools, running hospitals, running all sorts of educational institutions or even prisons, and if we can just structure some kind of a financial instrument, like a social investment bond, where we would pay Goldman Sachs based on the outcome of their work, whether they actually are curing enough people, or whether they actually are educating enough students, or whether they are actually re-educating prisoners. We can actually sort of fill some of the gaps that are left through privatization of the welfare state. Right? And it's a very big chunk of where the elites have spent the last 15, 20 years. It was in building all sorts of coalitions between foundations, the financial sector, and various local governments and institutions to create social innovation of finance, right? So if you go and search for social investment bonds, if you sort of spend some time looking at it, you can clearly see that the financial sector is there not just to plunder and pillage, it's there to basically help us get things done, right? Including increasingly infrastructure, right? And that brings us to the second pillar, which is urban, right? If you look at how much of this hype around infrastructure in the last 15 or 20 years has emerged and has evolved, it has all been about we need to go and untap the vast resources that are basically lying dormant in pension funds, in private equity firms, in all sorts of big, giant financial institutions, and put those resources to good use by having them purchase and invest into infrastructure, right? Roads, airports, garbage collection, you name it. Right? Why? Because basically the previous Keynesian or Fordist model of getting infrastructure built was governments taking on the role and then basically making that infrastructure available for everyone was no longer possible for reasons that we can discuss, and you probably know what they are. So we have to again enroll the private sector into doing that, and we have to create the right financial incentives and so forth. Right? I think ultimately, if you kind of follow that logic a bit deeper and a bit longer, you will see how you arrive at something like the smart city, right? As a kind of the culmination of that, right? Where the idea is that not only can you enroll the private sector into building fantastic but privatized infrastructure, but you can also actually help to do things cheaper, at least that what the promise is, the reality is often different, and that will also help local municipalities, offices, and so forth to get through the harsh austerity measures that have been imposed on them. So, in a typical kind of, overlap between the logic of, the hacker in the classical kind of definition, we need to learn how to do more with less, that logic meets the logic of austerity, which ultimately is the same thing. You need to learn how to do more with less, right? And ultimately, I think those two logics in one way or another give us something like the smart city, right? Which, of course, finally, and, you can then, again, I'm packing a lot of material into just 20 minutes, but even within that urban populism, you'll see that there are many other dimensions there, right? All this stuff about will mayors rule the world, how cities can become more powerful than nation states, that we should now start solving all the problems at the level of the city, this is where all the creative hipsters are, so, all the innovation has to happen here. I mean, like, I can go on and on and on. I mean, you can clearly see it if you kind of follow this rhetoric quite closely, right? That there is this immense expectation being put on cities to fulfill missions that I think they are not actually capable of fulfilling. And somewhere between those two populisms, the financial one and the urban one, you also see a lot of other kind of weird projects, right? So actually I look at it as a bit of a Venn diagram where, three circles intersect, the finance, cities, and technology, and you can actually position quite a few of the problems we are facing now somewhere there. So the intersection of cities and finance, you'll also probably see the origins of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. You'll see how another type of populism at the intersection of those two, the populism of home ownership and the ideology of home ownership, that we should all basically get access to cheap credit, go get a loan, buy ourselves a house, and then, end up in some kind of mortgage slavery, how it also registers, right? And how then it's linked to a much broader kind of idea that ultimately we are all entrepreneurs, so why not just treat ourselves as an enterprise, borrow across our entire life cycle, and that way we can actually become the true entrepreneurial selves as Margaret Thatcher would want us, right? There is a lot of stuff that you can actually understand by looking at the intersection of these logics. But I think the most powerful populism that's still around now, and it's probably gaining power, and I don't think that that power is going to diminish even with the election of Trump, is that revolving around technology, right? And here, it's not just about, what I used to call solutionism, right? The idea that you can delegate responsibility for problem solving to these private actors, and they will come and help us, manage refugees, solve climate change, fight obesity, you name it. You can probably hardly find a problem that now does not have some kind of app to go with it, right? But I think there is actually a much deeper problem revolving around technological populism, right? And technopopulism, if you want to put it that way. And it's the idea that somehow, we can fight our way out of crisis if only we build the right coalitions between various sectors in Silicon Valley and outside. So, we can actually, solve the problems of public transportation if only we find a way to recruit Uber into the provision of some of the public transportation services, as happens in a lot of cities in America already. I don't know if you realize it, but if you look at small towns in Florida or New Jersey, instead of investing money that they don't have into building public transit and public transportation, they're actually subsidizing Uber in order to provide cheaper transportation to their citizens, right? So citizens, instead of paying $4 to get from their house to the metro station or to whatever the train station, they'll pay just $2, with the city picking up the rest. Right? And you can kind of go sector by sector, from transportation to energy, from energy to health. What would you see in health? You'll see that Google comes to the British National Health Service, offers its AI service called DeepMind, and says that if only you let us access 4 million documents of 4 million patients, their health data, would be able to make a prediction about kidney disease and notify those patients in advance, which will then save you the money you don't have anyway to finance your national health service. Right? You can basically go and move from a sector to sector, and you will see that there are such promises and expectations being made, all revolving around free stuff that apparently can fall on us from Silicon Valley. Right? And I think this idea of free stuff, I know it's in itself, even the critique of this freedom has become quite banal, but I think we have to understand that the problem here is much deeper than just saying that if stuff is free, then you're the product. That's not the main problem. I think the main problem that many of us have failed to understand is that in the last 15 years, what has happened is that we have in fact had Silicon Valley providing a lot of welfare-enhancing services. And by this I mean that a lot of the goods and services they offered were in fact offered for free, right? And it's possible that with a lot of new services that are developing in health, energy, transportation, and so forth, even more of them will be developed for free and offered for free, right? And you kind of all know by now why it's done for free. It's done for free because they are basically extracting data, right? So the term that I use for this is data extractivism. Right? That there is actually a giant data extractivist industry that comes up with all sorts of tricks and free goods in order to extract as much data as possible. And I think, the traditional critique here would be to say, oh, all these people are making money with advertising, so they have to share some revenue with us. I think it's fine, it's a reasonable critique, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is that all of that data in the last 10 years has been used in order to generate and build the most advanced services of artificial intelligence and deep learning, creating a system that is now essentially controlled just by 5 firms, Amazon, IBM, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, who are the only players that are actually capable of offering AI as a service. And the model of the future is the same as now exists with cloud computing, where basically, if you need some cloud computing, you need some processing done in the cloud, you go to Amazon, you pay it money, and Amazon sells it to you, and everybody is happy. I think to some extent, this is what's already happening with AI. I mean, actually, just this week, Amazon announced that they are creating a cloud for AI, where you will be charged for doing any operations requiring image recognition, voice recognition, classification of voice commands that you give, and you'll have to pay for that, right? And I think you have to understand how that world will look like. I think ultimately, with automation of industry, automation of whatever is left of the welfare state that's not yet completely privatized, which also means, health, energy, education, transportation, and so forth, all of that in one way or another will have that AI element, and we will have to pay to a number of firms, in this case 4 or 5, for basically doing things that we need, right? So, when your health service is no longer functioning and it's powered by AI to produce savings, you can easily imagine that even though the front end of those goods is free, you might still be using Google for free. I mean, ultimately, you'll still be paying to it through your taxes in one way or another, because somebody will have to pay to Google for being present in your health system, right, and in your health service. And I think that does create a situation where a new kind of rentiers, if you will, are emerging. And in a sense, I don't see why we shouldn't treat it like we would treat people who would come and, buy up all the land and then charge us rent for it. So in that sense, I don't see why we shouldn't be treating these firms that have engaged in massive act of data extractivism over the last 10 or 15 years, have built the most advanced systems, have done it partially because of very lax antitrust attitude in the United States. I mean, if you actually basically broke up Google into 100 firms, I don't think that self-driving cars would have been possible. Like, I literally think that the reason why these firms managed to do what they did was partially because they were treated as monopolists, and nobody basically touched them, right? Which creates all sorts of challenges. So I see I'm running out of time. I would just like to kind of show where to go from here, right? If you buy into the narrative, and then, sorry, before I sort of get to solutions, you can then go and basically start tracking how all of these 3 populists interact. So you can basically go and unpick something like the sharing economy or Airbnb. It's my own alarm. See how something like Airbnb or Uber or sharing economy or, you name it, the smart city, how you can actually kind of place it on the map, right? Where value is generated and how value will actually be produced and then snatched by these firms. So I think if you buy into this narrative that data will be a new, factor of production, if you will, you then have to start asking what are the ways of blocking it and creating alternative structures, instruments, legal regimes that will not create this massive social dependency on just 4 or 5 firms. And I think that the only way to do that would be, A, to start treating data as a factor of production, right? And as something that probably has to be owned by us and citizens, meaning. And it has to be done in a way where, if a local town or a local neighborhood wants to build something around data and AI, they have to be able to have access to it, and access to it in a way where, there will not be a commercial relationship with a service provider who will then dictate the terms. This is why I think, something like a cooperative, even built around data, would not work. Because it will be very hard to build AI on a cooperative model that will actually be able to compete with Google. I'm more than happy to see examples, but I think, you can build a nice local alternative built on the cooperative model to Uber, when Uber has drivers competing with drivers that will be driving for a cooperative. I don't think that your local cooperative will be able to pull off a self-driving car, no matter how hard these guys work in the garage. In part because at this point it's all about data and very little about actual development and innovation and whatever it is that you do in the garage, right? And for this reason, I think we really have to think about it at the level of industrial strategy and national strategy, and stop this localism, which in itself is just an extension of the urban populism I have just been criticizing, right? These problems will not be solved on a local level. At this point, I even doubt they'll be solved at the national level. To dream that they can be solved at the European level, given where Europe is right now, is a bit unrealistic. But I think ultimately we have to live in reality. Like, there is no way that just by the joining of local efforts we'll get to solve this issue. Because ultimately it does draw on 20 years, not just of data extractivism, but the particular legal regimes, like what I've mentioned, the antitrust attitude in the United States, free flow of data provisions in various trade treaties, and so forth, right? I think technological sovereignty as a kind of flag, as a kind of issue around which we can rally, makes a lot of sense, but ultimately, it needs also some content, right? It needs filling in, and it needs filling in a way which will, I think, take note and account of all those hurdles and false exits, if you want to put it that way, that are offered by localism, cooperativism, and whatnot. Right? I think we have to understand that ultimately, if that is the real issue, then the solutions will need to be much bigger, and they will need to be much bigger than just cities. Right? No matter how exciting it might be for us to build an alternative to the smart city. Because if the smart city will be powered by advanced AI, that is made possible by data collection, not just on the national, but on the global level, there is no city that's capable of, not that IBM Watson works perfectly, I think it's basically, a marketing trick, but it will be very hard to build something of that level, given that IBM invested probably $3 billion into it over the last 5 years, or 10 years, whatever, how long they have been investing in it. It's not something that you can just create overnight by running an app competition. Right? Which is kind of where cities are, unfortunately. And I'm not even sure it has to be tackled on the city level. Right? So having said all of this, I think I'll shut up.
Thank you very much, Evgeny. Before I present the remaining panel, maybe one question directly to you. If neoliberalism isn't in this zombie state, if it's constantly evolving, rapidly evolving, creating new technologies and adapting to them, and there's a lot of examples, a lot of disappointments for the left, that concepts once developed by the left and seen as liberating, potentially, like the internet at first, open source, basic income. I just heard Elon Musk, Barack Obama, and furthermore, they're in favor of basic income. So neoliberalism is moving that fast. How do we get ahead of that? What's the criteria to say, okay, that's really against or ahead of neoliberalism?
Yeah, I think producing ideas is not necessarily a problem that the left had, I think, and it's the opposite, to be honest. It's like there are far too many ideas untied to any local realizations of them. And at this point, it looks that Silicon Valley, to take something like basic income, is just much better positioned to just get it done. I mean, look what Google wants to do. Google wants to build a private city. Right? I mean, they keep talking about it. I'm sure they'll unroll it somewhere next year. They'll go to North Dakota and say, we'll build you a private city. Just let us do it. Everything will be run by us, health, energy, transportation, and so forth, and we'll offer basic income to somebody. In that sense, I mean, they are much better prepared. I think it would be nice if the left had a much, how should I put it, more hands-on attitude. I think, we've been kind of joking about it with some colleagues, but what is badly needed is something like McKinsey of the left, where you actually get some administrative implementation capacity, where, instead of spending 6 months giving interviews when you become, a radical left government, you actually start executing things, right? And avoid the fate of Syriza. I mean, you really want to have people who are well trained, and it's a challenge. And I think it's a challenge in that so much intellectual capacity on the left went into things like critical theory, which I love, but it's not exactly helpful to running a country.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Francesca, Bria, and then directly ask a question about what can be done on city level after introducing her. She has a background in social science, was a researcher and teaching associate at Imperial College Business School. She advised city councils as well as the European Commission on innovation policy and open cities policy. And earlier this year, she was appointed Commissioner for Technology and Digital Innovation by the new municipal government in Barcelona under Ada Colau. Former activist become mayor, and I have to say, all of my Spanish friends, they really speak very highly of her and her team and what they've been achieving in the last year. So, Francesca, what can be done from your experience on a city level?
Hello. Yeah. Hi, everyone. So now I'm asked to say exactly what Evgeny said we should not do, which is basically say that cities can solve everything and city will just fix the world and we have a wonderful mayor and she's the leader. Maybe I should start with by this. No. I actually have a reflection about the talk and then I get to the point of what cities can do. So my reflection, listening to a lot of what Evgeny was saying, in particular, I mean, he's framing the problems in terms of financial policy and clearly, I mean, debt and austerity on one side, and then, you know, the question of the new power. So the new power, which are these technology giants and the kind of Silicon Valley players that are coming in and actually building the world of the future. So he's saying, you know, they're laying out the infrastructure of the future, I mean, which is going to be the basic infrastructure, like we today think about schools and hospitals and roads and houses, yeah? And they are doing it through financial means, but aggregating a lot of powers and then rolling it out as if it is their thing. So they're actually building it in privately. And you know, when we're talking about connectivity and AI and data, this is the critical infrastructure of the future. And when he's thinking, I mean, when he's speaking like that, you know, my first thought was, and what are governments doing? Because, you know, it would be nice that you have, okay, you know, we have all the evil here, and we have the big banks, and we have the private corporations, but we the government, and we the people. So the problem is that our governments, I mean, starting from actually our European governments, they are actually making this possible. And I mean, who is running Europe? A banker, right? And, you know, an ex-Mao, so he's a nice guy. He's also, actually he's a nice guy. No, and also, for instance, I'm Italian, I'm not Spanish, although I'm very proud to be serving Ada Colau's government right now. What is our prime minister doing now? He has appointed this year as chief digital commissioner for Italy, which is not only in charge of like apps and, you know, some like creative culture policies, but is in charge of industrial policy, which is basically a vice president of Amazon in secondment. So which also show the kind of corruption level that you have in governments where, you know, these people are basically running governments. And so he is now, you know, laying out all this big infrastructure project with AI and all the kind of new technology stuff. Is Amazon basically doing it in my country. And so you expect that all the policies that go with the Silicon Valley model, of course, this is the way that we imagine running Italy, right? And I mean, this is not the only examples. We have a lot of other examples that this is what is happening. So the question is, I mean, we had an example actually very interesting in Europe as well when it comes to Uber, where the former digital commissioner of Europe, Nelly Cruz, that was running the kind of digital agenda policy and the industrial policy when it comes to digital in Europe, now shifted to the digital single market policy. She then, when she stopped to be a commissioner, she became a high-level consultant for Uber. And I mean, and we have Barroso that's now consulting Goldman Sachs. I mean, we can go on and on to say what is happening. So basically, you know, my question is, you know, we should maybe that's the political question, which is how do we get back the power to the people, yeah? And I think that Richard can talk a little bit about that, which means the ability to run the public space, to run government in a way that is not completely hijacked by these kind of policies. And then, you know, when I think about infrastructure at this large scale, I mean, I have to say, you know, the cooperative agenda to me, I mean, Barcelona, for instance, we are pushing that forward very much. We're investing public money, we're giving support. There is a cooperativist movement that's very, with a long tradition historically, is very grounded and everything. But, you know, this is never gonna be enough. I mean, you know, the reason why Uber and Airbnb and all these corporations can build platform, that kind of platforms, is because they're building on top of a large-scale infrastructure that's been built by the security state and run by the US. So this is a fact. And I mean, it is very clear that, for instance, here in Europe, we are not doing that in a democratic way. I mean, we are not rolling out a civic, democratic infrastructure for the future that will run hospital, preserving some kind of welfare state, and schools and education. We're not doing it anymore. So also our companies, our, you know, startups and our creative guys, they go to Silicon Valley, they go into, you know, they're asking money to venture capitalists, and I mean, their only hope is to be bought by these big companies, yeah? So I see very little alternative in that sense here, because basically we are not putting forward, I mean, we're not giving this fight. And that's one big question, and really goes beyond cities, because, I mean, I guess we wonder what cities can do, but really on that level, you need a larger scale power in order to stop that or to do something. And I think, you know, if we're seeing some technological sovereignty, it isn't coming from Europe at this point, but definitely it is coming from BRICS countries. I mean, it is coming from China. It is coming from India sometimes. It is coming from Russia. I mean, definitely, you know, they're building their own technology industry. They're building their own software, hardware, cloud system. They have regulation where they say, you can leave the data here, and if you use citizen data, if you access my citizen data, there is data localization regimes, meaning it applies some kind of jurisdiction that the citizens have decided for. I mean, it's not that, you know, Russia and China are the example of the democratic countries. They're pretty authoritarian, but I mean, aren't we in a kind of authoritarian capitalist phase where, you know, we have also the President of the United States that's not like the example of a radical direct democracy. So, yeah, I mean, maybe we do it around, and I can get to the point where what cities can do. I believe that cities can do a lot.
Okay. I'm going to ask Richard the same question I asked Evgeny. You might answer it or not, but first I'm going to introduce you quickly. Richard is author of the founding document, I'd like to say, the little red book of the critique of the mindset of digital capitalism, the Californian ideology.
With Andy Cameron.
Yeah, co-author, published 20 years ago. He lectures at University of Westminster and just recently spearheaded Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn's new Digital Democracy Manifesto, which he presented here this afternoon. He considers himself, he told me, a cyber communist, which leads me to my first question. How do we cyber communists get ahead of digital neoliberalism when maybe I can add that that the Silicon Valley, what they think about the digital manifesto, you can read it in a Wired article, and they said basically, well, some measures are being implemented already. We know that some are questioned, but in general, it's like they say, all right, we can cope with that. Any ideas, Richard?
Well, you referred to this article as I wrote for a Marshall McLuhan conference in the just actually during the dot-com bubble in New York. And so what I wanted to do, Marshall McLuhan had these things called thought probes. So he would say something that would make people think, not necessarily the most accurate thing. So I got up and said, well, you know, here we are in the middle of the dot-com bubble, and America has built the first working model of communism in human history. It's called the internet. And this was obviously a provocation. But it's interesting if you think about this, because in a way there's two types of it. There is this sort of communism with the capital C, Stalinist version. Because if you think whatever the Stasi did with industrial technology, the NSA and GCHQ and BND, of course, as we found out, is doing with these digital technologies. They you know, Stasi were amateurs, basically, compared to this sort of amount of data they're collecting on you, and the ability to track it and to predict, actually, what you're going to do as well. You know, it's not just thought crimes, this is precog, as if you watch those sorts of, you know, Philip K. Dick paranoia movies, you know. So there's that, but there's also this other side of it, which I think we've also been talking about today, that actually part of what capitalism summons up these technologies, these hardwares and software, but the fact that there's this imperative to continually extract exchange value, the accumulation of capital as capital, is actually restricting how we can use them. In fact, the potentiality of the technologies is continually being thwarted. And if anybody, I don't know, whether you're techies or business or in institutions, they're always coming up against this. And actually, you know, a lot of these technologies are used in a very shall we say, almost perverse way. You spend a lot of time, if you work in the public sector of Britain, you spend a lot of time collecting completely useless data, analysing it, sending it upstairs, and then they ask you to collect exactly the same data, but in a slightly different variant, and goes upstairs. And so in a way they get drowned by data. The data starts to overwhelm them, and it actually makes the system dysfunctional, even from the narrow capitalist sense of the word. And I see, this is where I would disagree with you, Janie. Perhaps because I'm older. I can remember the transition from Fordism to neoliberalism. I didn't vote in the 1979 general election because I thought there was actually no difference between right-wing Labour and Thatcher's Conservative Party. 6 months later, I joined the Labour Party, realising that there was, and have been in ever since. So I think we are, I would disagree, I think we are actually at the end game of neoliberalism. The confusion is it's not the end game of capitalism. See, capitalism has gone through various stages, and we can see certainly in the post-war era, we've had this long decline in the rate of profit. Every decade, the rate of profit falls slightly. And you can actually predict, I have friends with mathematical certainty are predicting forward to when the final collapse comes, when the rate of profit gets down to zero. But that's the solution, of course, last time round was have a world war. Have a world war, wipe out 50 million people, blow everything up, and then you can have a massive rise in the rate of profit, deploy lots of new machinery, and the whole system can start again. We had this long period of Fordism done because of you could have high wages and high profit. Then the crisis comes, and I said, I'm the punk generation. I can remember living through that crisis of Fordism, and out came the other end, came neoliberalism. In the 80s and certainly in the 90s, particularly in the Californian ideology version, neoliberalism was evil, but it worked. Now neoliberalism is evil, and it doesn't work in a really fundamental way. And one of the key ways you can see it is it hasn't raised the rate of profit in recent years. So you have this enormous surplus of capital washing around the world economy, desperately looking for somewhere to invest, but there isn't anything to invest in. You use the example of Uber. Financial Times have been running these really hilarious articles, which is basically Uber is just burning money. It's a fantasy that actually Uber is basically replace all the mini cab companies with an app, but actually it's never made any money. It's actually its product, a bit like the dot-com bubble. In these, the product of most dot-com companies was shares. They didn't actually produce anything. They produced this promise that it was going to make lots of money. People bought into it. Some people made money if you invested in Amazon or something like eBay, but most of them just went poof. Yeah? So you have a couple of monopolists which make very high rates of profit, because they're monopolies, and then the rest of them, it all goes up in a puff of smoke. The Financial Times reckons that Uber is one of those ones. So we don't know. So the Uber model of capitalism might be bankruptcy. Okay. So I would think, so the question then is, what's the replacement? And that, I think, is what's more interesting. Because I said, you know, if you go through the forward, you know, we can go back, liberalism, you know, there was the slave mode, you know, in the United States there was slavery and capitalism. Certainly in England there was a long period of liberalism and capitalism. Then we had Fordism as capitalism. And now we've gone through this period of neoliberalism. Is what are we having next? And one of the things that people, friends of mine, have said, there's a particularly really good book I recommend by Radhika Desai called Geopolitical Economy. And a few years ago, she was predicting that the world economy would break up into regional blocks. And so if you go to America, the rationality behind Trump is not populism, it's protectionism. It's that America doesn't, you know, it's the Pat Buchanan program, you know, no free trade, no foreign wars, no immigration. And it makes sense. And it also makes sense for China, for you know, South Asia, for Latin America. And that's where the Europeans have to get their act together. Because I said, I come from a country which has just voted for Brexit, 2/3 of whom think that England is not neoliberal enough, and 1/3 of them think it's too neoliberal. Yeah? But what that means for us, and how we think about a continental-wide alternative to American, you know, a subordination to the American hegemon, and how we come out the other end, I don't know. Whether that then leads to, you know, I guess I am a cybernetic communist, I will admit it. But even a European social democracy, how does that work using these two technologies, making their full potential? Okay, that's what we have to think about here.
Left answers is in the title of this panel, and I would like to ask you, Evgeny. There's a lot of people on the left who claim we need our own algorithms, our own software platforms, or infrastructure. Now, if I understood you right, you say platform cooperativism, grassroots, we cannot possibly compete with IBM's Watson just because of a matter of scale. It will lead to amateurism or self-exploitation if we try to build alternative infrastructures. So does it come down for left radical answers to expropriate the expropriators? Or what would you suggest? How do we get ahead?
Sure. Well, I mean, I do have a certain allergy towards localism in that, you know, I think there are a lot of good intellectual points you can make about projects that are more moral or ethical than Uber or Airbnb. I think it would be extremely hard to scale them. So in that sense, I do think that it's a bit useless to be searching for non-neoliberal algorithms or platforms if the solution is meant to work beyond your neighborhood or community of users. In that sense, I think what's needed is a fundamental rethink of data as a thing. You know, what kind of entity is it? What kind of legal regime should govern it? Whether, you know, look at how, you know, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren talk about Uber and sort of Amazon and platforms. You know, for them, the main problem about Amazon and Uber and this entire industry is that they might be engaging in anti-competitive practices. So we have to really watch closely what they do. We have to make sure that they do not sort of penetrate far too many verticals at the same time. We have to make sure that they don't discriminate and so forth. I think it's kind of very unambitious for politicians who claim to be populists, in part because it misunderstands that the ability of these firms to offer all those goods for us, including AI, but also goods that are extremely cheap, comes precisely from their size. I mean, I didn't mention it in my lecture, but normally I do, that, you know, part of this financial populism also was that you can actually compensate for falling real incomes through basically deregulating monopolies. So, you know, the reason why Walmart is able to offer you goods at such low prices is precisely because it has been allowed to become this giant firm with supply chains that, you know, are tremendous, that are then generating savings for you, right? So a lot of the cheap stuff in America comes precisely from the size of those firms. So anyone who would now like to challenge that paradigm will need to be ready that, you know, things will change, and they will change in a way that you'll actually even alienate a lot of the people who would otherwise be on your side. But to me, it also kind of fundamentally misrecognizes, if you will, the qualities of information. I mean, information is not like oil. You know, oil doesn't become more valuable just because you store more of it in your warehouse. I mean, data does. I mean, the more data you have, the more insights you can derive. You know, it has qualities which you do not have in like tables or widgets. So I'm just not sure that the left actually has the right populist stance on data. And I think instead of talking about the competitiveness of these companies, they really have to start like looking at data as something that ought not be owned by these firms. I would like to live in a world where it's Amazon who pays us a fee for using AI and data that is ours, and not a world where we pay Amazon for using services that are generated with our data. To me, that's insanity. I mean, it has to work the other way around, where it's us, society, cities, states, who control it, and then they have to pay us a licensing fee, and not the other way around, right? And that's a true populism on data of the left. Right, and I think that needs to be sort of arrived at and articulated. I just would like to say one word in response to Richard. I actually think that, well, more than one probably. If you look at how most profitable sectors in the American economy operate, if you look at the big pharma, I think big pharma makes so much money for a simple reason, because much of their profit is guaranteed by law. Because according to American law, you know, big pharma can charge the US government whatever they want, basically for, you know, health products, right? Because the US healthcare system is privatized and there are regulations which basically tie big pharma to the government. I think the future of big tech is exactly on that model. And you already see it with Uber providing public transportation in these forgotten tiny American cities, where their profits of providing, you know, some kind of last mile of the transportation industry are also guaranteed. And once you switch to that model where the government guarantees you a contract for serving your electricity needs, serving your garbage needs, which is kind of what the smart city model does, serving your transportation needs and so forth, I mean, these companies will feel quite comfortable. So I'm not sure that Uber is bankrupt. I mean, Uber clearly is undercharging us for our rides because they have giant pockets funded by venture capitalists, government of Saudi Arabia and Goldman Sachs. They can do that for 5 or 10 years, extract, as I keep telling, as much data as they can, roll out self-driving cars, radically reduce the costs, and then sign contracts with governments for providing public transportation, delivery, logistics, and so forth. To me, that's the model. But the very last thing I would like to say is that I actually see a lot of consistency between what we are seeing now with Trump and what has been happening in the economy before. I mean, for the last 30 years, if you look at the state of the US economy, but also of the economy in Europe, it's been dominated by, you know, the so-called FIRE sector, right? Finance, insurance, and real estate. You can kind of, you know, play with some nice kind of intrusion of technology into it and add data. So, you know, occasionally I joke and say that the real sector we have to be looking at is called FIRED. So it's, you know, finance, insurance, real estate, and data. But ultimately, you know, the resurgence of Trump and the fact that he became president and all the people he now appointed to his councils, the government and so forth, all of them are billionaires, all of them come from finance. They all come from Goldman Sachs, they all come from real estate, they'll probably appoint someone from insurance. I just don't see that rupture that we were supposed to have. I mean, ultimately, you know, the previous administration, as much as it was dependent on Goldman Sachs, you know, was already labeled neoliberal. This one is even more. Like, how could you possibly imagine that like 3 months ago when Trump was attacking them in every single ad? Right, so in that sense, we can talk, of course, about the mechanics, whether this regime is able to deliver, but to me, it's also a bit unreasonable to be hearing that there are no profitable things to invest in. I mean, if you look at the rise of alternative asset class in, you know, in sort of within the financial industry, which counts things like infrastructure, which counts things like even, you know, like parts of the welfare state like pensions, I mean, all of that is the most profitable sector. I mean, you can make 8 or 9% in an economy that delivers just 1 or 2 by basically having your pension fund invest into infrastructure, which explains why so much of our world is privatized. And you know, that will keep going. I mean, they will keep privatizing more and more and basically putting a toll-like model where you have to pay a toll for not just driving on a highway, but also, for going to the toilet, for, sleeping in your bed. I mean, I will keep extracting value. I just don't see how in a world where sensors are everywhere, payment systems are everywhere, you'll see less of that. Of course you'll see more of that. I mean, to me, it's like by default. Of course, we can talk about rebellion, people not accepting that model, but there is perfect continuity with what has been happening before. And now that you put financial guys and real estate guys in charge, it will only get worse.
Francesca, before we open the discussion for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on this nice vision of the future, I mean, I do think actually that we have to put the emphasis on where the struggles are. I don't think, yes, there will be rebellion in wherever, but they will charge you for everything. I think that actually we have to think of where the struggles are currently and where they will be coming from. Because I mean, I do see two questions here which are very basic. I mean, first of all, governments, in particular local governments, many of them are now broke. So they won't be continuing, I mean, it is a broken model because they won't be continuing to invest in having some kind of sensor network that operate their lighting system, while at the same time having a disconnected sensor network that operate their mobility, while at the same time having some kind of smart asset that operates something else, because basically this is not sustainable, there is no business model behind it, and there is no public investment that can go there anymore. So in a sense, I do see a limit there. And also this explains what is happening, for instance, in Barcelona. I mean, where is a city where it was the example of the smart city, where it was supposed to operate this way, where you're actually laying out infrastructure that's completely privatized and completely non-interoperable. So even that, on a certain point you end up with the traffic light doesn't communicate with your, with your lighting system, and then, nothing matches, and so you cannot actually run the city. And basically, it is dysfunctional, but what it made actually broke, it wasn't a kind of technocratic approach to this. I mean, meaning that, you realize that you need more interoperability and open standards and no, it was like the popular housing movement that needed affordable housing and actually needed, I mean, there was a popular movement. So, and again, the reason why we're putting in place now policies that are about, I mean, not only affordable housing, and I mean, that's why we're fighting with Airbnb. I mean, it's not because we don't like platform capitalism, or because, we think, this data matching markets are dysfunctional. But because this affects the housing market price, and this basically, it's expelling people from the city. So, and for instance, why are we creating now in Barcelona a municipal company which is going to be owned by citizens and the government and cooperatives involving the unions as well that will operate energy? I mean, clearly, why are we doing that? I mean, it's because, there is a need, because, we have a large part of the population that cannot pay the bills of their energy bills, and there is energy poverty. And again, I mean, we're saying that, these gadgets, the Internet of Things gadgets, definitely there is a market. I mean, I'm in that field, like I go to every single conferences. I mean, I actually like technology, and I would like to see an enhanced technological, society that where we own that, and we can determine the kind of welfare state that we want. We can reshape it, and we can redefine what kind of life we're living. I mean, the problem is that the Internet of Things, even the way it's operating, and this kind of AI system, I mean, actually at the moment, who is going to buy these gadgets? It's far too many. We have lots of unemployed youth, It's like they have money to pay the rent. They don't even have money to rent Airbnb anymore. Actually, they don't even have money to rent their own flat, which is on Airbnb. It's too expensive. And so, so you do have a crisis of labor and of social reproduction. And I think that this will actually, so we need to see this kind of struggles that will reinvent the system. Because I think that you know, and even if it doesn't do it at scale, that can immediately challenge these kind of companies. And although I don't want to like say localism and everything, but we need to build capacity. And so to build capacity, you need to empower people. Like there is something basic that we're doing in Barcelona, which is saying, okay, we can't change everything. We can do small irreversible changes. I said it in the panel before, but I think, you know, I really like this. Small irreversible changes in the system is a little bit of technocratic populism from the left, you know, which is like we kind of change the system slowly. And I think, you know, for instance, we cannot change everything, but we're saying now we invest this amount of public money, and I mean, we cannot immediately say, okay, we don't operate anymore large infrastructure with big companies. Of course, we need big companies to operate large infrastructure. At the same time, we are putting clauses in big contracts, which implies, for instance, public ownership of data, and then labor standards, and gender standards, and environmental standards, and we start changing the relationship that you have with companies. At the same time, we're starting to invest, we want to arrive to 50-50, much more resources into the alternatives, into the commons, into the talent of the city, because we need to build this new system with the people. I mean, I don't think, you know, we can leave as we can't leave the corporations to do it, we can't leave the political class to do it. I mean, this is right the moment where we actually need to create new system where we have to empower the alternatives, because this is the only way to get the alternatives to grow. And if the alternatives grow, then they can start to become more kind of systemic. And then you can actually start saying that you have a transportation system that is still public, but operate more on the logic of Uber, meaning it exploits distributed networks, it can exploit the network effect and the infrastructure, technologically enable infrastructure, but at the same time preserve solidarity and worker rights and the basic democratic accountability. I mean, it is not science fiction. It is practiced. I mean, we are doing it, and we have a lot of experiments around. And I mean, of course, we need to tackle the large-scale problems, but we also need to start reinventing the next.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. We are ready to accept questions from the audience.
Can I just make one key point? Is that austerity is a lie, right? There is enough money, right? Let's just make this absolutely clear. This idea that governments don't have enough money is a lie, right? And it's the biggest lie of neoliberalism. The first thing is if they want to spend money on wars, they always have money. If they want to have money, spend money on bailing the banks out, they always have money. But it's even more fundamental than that. Is that any state which has a sovereign currency or can actually just print money, right? We allow banks to make money. Why doesn't the state make money? Well, we talk about quantitative easing. If you can quantitatively ease for the banks, why don't we quantitatively ease for the infrastructure? Yeah, precisely to build the framework, as Francesca said, to allow the cooperative sector to take over the economy. Yeah. We should go to Frankfurt and say, don't give the money to the Deutsche Bank, give it to us. We can use it better. You know, this has been the whole lie of the last 30 years, actually, that you have to, is to push down the living standards and wages of the working class to somehow up the rate of profit. It doesn't work even for capitalism, let alone for us. I mean, what we need now is an intelligent use of the wealth and knowledge of our society, and to use these technologies to actually build a better way of doing things, a truly human civilization.
Dimitri?
Hi, this one? Hi. I just have two questions to kind of help think about the political strategy that's implied in this, related to kind of 2 points that Evgeny made in his opening presentation. One of them is that localized groups couldn't, for instance, invent the self-driving car. So kind of to understand how to respond to that, I'd like to know why I should care if they can create a self-driving car or not, why I shouldn't prefer public transit, for instance. And the second is you referred to data as a rent capturing asset, right? And called for its kind of like public control of this, right? Should we extend that to all rent capturing assets, including IP and real estate and every other rent capturing asset as well? Or do you think that we can have kind of an only data public control of this?
Okay, thank you for your inputs. But I have a big contradiction with the first speaker. You said, because you talked about this thesis against localism and everything to face a left strategy, and you were talking about the data and extracting data in toilet and what do you?
Excuse me, could you maybe stand up and speak up a bit? We are hard to understand.
Okay, sorry. I have a big contradiction with the first speaker, because you were talking so much against localism to face a left-wing strategy, and I really do not understand that, because you were talking about the data is the biggest thing that we have to face, and that in everyday life there is value extracted in toilets and in our everyday life. But then you have a big lack in your theory when you say that data is produced in Silicon Valley. Data is not produced in Silicon Valley. Data maybe is reproduced in Silicon Valley, but data is produced in our everyday life. And so I think we have to face in the local, in our everyday life, how we, all of us, are producing this data while using smartphones, while using, I don't know, intelligent fridge or Uber or other apps. So I didn't understand your thesis against localism, because if we want to have to face a left-wing strategy, we have to start in the local, and we have to start to rethink analog and digital life together.
Okay, maybe one more question here in the front, fourth row. Guy in the blue sweater, yeah.
My question is actually more of a comment or putting something on a map. There was the question of where the struggles are. And then I want to refer also back to the question of the city. I'm not sure whether we do the right thing if we give primacy to the city. One of the reasons why I think that one of the principal struggles that I see playing out now at the moment against global capital is actually taking place in North Dakota. With the North Dakota access pipeline. So I'm not sure whether we just only focus on the city, but rather the city needs energy. So where is that coming from? I mean, some of these struggles, they really play out across the board on different planes. And I mean, to think that and think that together, I think is one of the principal challenges that I see for us.
I'll try then. Okay, so the first questions from Dmitry. I think, look, I'm with you on public transportation. Like, I don't really care about self-driving cars either, but I know that there are a lot of cooperatives that do want to create cooperatives as alternatives to Uber. So, I mean, they do have drivers and they do operate with cabs as the primary model. So, within my example, you know, it kind of makes sense. If you accept that what they do is valid, which, you know, I might have questions about it, then you just have to point out. But anyway, I don't think you have to stick to self-driving cars as opposed to taxis. I mean, you can stick to, you know, health diagnostics. You can stick to, you know, what does Google do now? Google has managed to tap into its artificial intelligence in order to optimize its own energy costs in their basically data centers. So because of their advanced artificial intelligence, they managed to cut energy costs by 30 or 40% in the data centers. So now they're actually selling it or beginning to sell it as a solution to others, so that because of the AI, they can actually come and help you reduce your energy costs. Now, of course, you can argue that, you know, big energy providers can also do that and be helpful, but you cannot easily replicate it on a local level. So unless we go all the way back to, I don't know, Vermont, and we just think about people making cheese and like that's the entire kind of universe, yes, you know, you don't really need any of that. But if you really want to think about energy, health, education, I mean, look at education. Well, like, do I want to live in a world where the only teacher that you have is a tablet that's heavily personalized and has algorithms in it? Like, no. But ultimately, this is where education is heading, and ultimately, I think you will find these firms, and they'll already do that, penetrate the school system, right? So the second question on how I think about other domains beyond data, I actually do think that there are differences between land and data. What I think we need is something at least as intellectually sophisticated as Georgism was to land. You need to come up with something that would not follow necessarily the same structure, but would at least break beyond this paradigm that data is either private property and the only way you can do is just to gather it and sell it, or you can just leave it with Google and that's it. Which, you know, Georgism in this case would probably imply leaving everything as it is and just taxing those firms by, you know, 50% more. I wouldn't necessarily approve of that, but I think we do need to think of alternative models that will be the data equivalent of, I don't know, land trusts and whatnot. Like, we haven't even got there yet, right? But we should. With regards to this question about data produced locally in Silicon Valley, I don't think I ever said it's being produced in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley runs the apparatus through which it's often extracted and analyzed, in part because we all use Apple or Android phones, and we use a lot of the devices and sensors, which in one way or another has this data passing through the systems of just 4 or 5 firms, which also means that they basically have access to it and they use it to train their own you know, algorithms and machine learning systems to do advanced tasks. So in that sense, I mean, I don't really see where the contradiction is. I mean, yes, of course, you can talk about how people locally can mobilize and how they can sort of understand that they're producing data. I'm all for it. It's just that you have to be prepared that you'll need to somehow build an operating system from scratch if you really want to compete with Android or Apple. I mean, it's not a trivial task. It's not like producing data with your gadget will just get you out of the predicament now where you are actually teaching the system whether you want it or not, because ultimately every click you make on your phone helps to refine Google's system. Maybe I'll leave it here and you can talk about North Dakota.
No, I mean, I agree with the remark. I mean, it's not, I don't think, you know, at least I think absolutely not here. There is no exclusivity on the city as a site of struggle. And also when we're talking about energy independency and energy transition and all of that, I know that the struggle is much bigger. But I mean, that never wants to be a kind of exclusivity of the city. Actually, if anything, we're identifying the limitation of seeing it only as the city. I mean, I think that definitely there is a part of this conversation, in particular when it comes, for instance, to struggles around data ownership, where the cities can play a very important role. And why? I mean, I think although it's counterintuitive, clearly the city cannot do what Evgeny just said, or like launch their own operating system or build their own whatever big, large infrastructure, because we wouldn't have the capacity. And it doesn't have to be the city. And I mean, Richard just was saying next to me that China has done it. I mean, the Chinese have done it. I mean, it's definitely possible. China has their own operating system, their own phones, their own infrastructure, their own like industry, and they're very precious of getting their data, the citizen data, to any US company. We know that. I mean, this is not happening. And I think, you know, if we have a problem, it's because in Europe we haven't been good enough to elevate this kind of issues at a level where we can have a proper political conversation about these things. And when we have it, I mean, even Merkel said it like in one of the last speech she did, that, you know, we need to demand algorithmic transparency to the platform companies. I mean, clearly what she's saying is recognizing this thing that who owned the data? I mean, and she's saying clearly representing the interests of the German manufacturers, which are driving the Industry 4.0 strategy, which are driving that kind of automation, the machine, you know, the driverless car, the automotive sectors, you know, and it's a little bit protectionist in that sense of of saying we have our own interest in terms of industry, and we have to build this roof over the house, meaning it's not possible that all the data end up in these like 5 US corporations. It just cannot be, because it will mean basically saying we have no competitive advantage anymore, we cannot build any economic capacity. So just like to end on the, one thing.
One thing, yeah, I agree with you completely, and she was probably saying it while playing with her iPhone.
Oh, the Merkel, yes, exactly. So why hasn't Europe done it? I mean, I'm really, actually, there is no reason. We had Nokia, I mean, sorry, I don't want to get into this dark hole, because we actually had it, so we could have done it. So that was a political choice of leaving the sovereignty to another region of the world, and we're just going with it. And I mean, of course, I'm not happy. But just to the city part, I think that the reason why cities can do something in this intermediation on the New Deal on data, or even preserving like some very basic citizen rights when it comes to data, is because the cities are the ones providing the services. So, you know, all these companies have to make a deal with the city at the end, you know, to be able to access our transportation system, access, you know, the infrastructure, and so the cities can mediate this until a level. Then there has to be a higher level of.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, it's more a comment or an enhancement, because you said only China is able to build an own operating system. It's not just China, also North Korea has their own Linux version. But actually, you can go online now and buy a Linux smartphone from a Spanish company even. It is possible. We have 2 Linux operating systems for smartphones in Europe. They're very usable. I enjoy having one, by the way.
I know.
And
I mean,
they work without Google or without Apple.
Yeah, I mean...
This is a stance of European bourgeoisie who has a lot of time on their hands and basically enjoys this luxury of, you know, spending hours and hours and like not relying on things like Google Now to optimize their day because, hey, I mean, they have plenty of time. I mean, Google is not stupid. I mean, it pitches itself very well through this populist rhetoric to people who actually need it. I mean, if you have 5 jobs, you have kids, and you have no time, I mean, you are in Google. Yes. I mean, then you have to pay a luxury premium to be offline, to be on Linux and do other things. I mean, you have to understand there is a political economy behind this luxury, and like you cannot present it as just an ethical dilemma.
I think you have an old school image of Linux in your head. The actual Linux, the actual Ubuntu smartphone is really a nice usability. It works quite well. Of course, it's still in development. But what I wanted to say, my argument that I'm making, if policymakers and politics would decide to invest just a little bit in free software, open source technologies, decentralization, and more like community-based cloud storage, stuff like that, there could be a transition to these systems that is possible at a fraction of the cost of the money they spend for some shit elsewhere.
No,
I think what Evgeny's point was that opting out...
I think this is a debate. I mean, first of all, you're speaking to people that are campaigning for this and doing it. Even at European level, I think I can't say I'm the one that have even convinced and lobbied a lot the European Commission to invest 60 million euros on this kind of project. Is a fraction, tiny fraction of what they invest on the rest. And so where are these politicians? Yeah. But then let's don't be naive, because this is not, let's don't be naive, because we know that, I mean, what some of the questions that Evgeny raised, you know, when you have to integrate different stacks, I mean, the technology is getting super complex, and that's what they're integrating, you know, vertically integrated platforms that do things at various levels. So unfortunately, even with that nice Ubuntu phone, you don't solve a lot of the problems we are talking about. And this doesn't justify the lack of investment.
But if you look at Facebook, I mean, like, if you're not on Facebook and you want to buy cheaper insurance, like, where are you going to get it? Like, now you have insurance firms that tell you, sign in with your Facebook account, we're going to lower your insurance premium. If I'm rich, I don't give a damn. Like, if I'm not, I would actually want to use it as a way to get discounts. Like, I don't understand why it's so hard to understand that there are very good economic incentives built for people being part of the system. You cannot just reduce this to some kind of ethical, moral dilemma and demand and like put all the responsibility on the subject. I mean, that would be exactly playing the neoliberal playbook.
I think I learned just recently that opting out is I think that's the point you're making is a luxury, or is privilege, and the ones, I think someone, I don't remember who, defined proletariat in these days, or precariat in these days, as precisely the ones that have not the luxury of opting out of these services for free, etc. We have a question here.
Hello?
This with
the
me,
question is not, it's not about like opting out individually. The question is about doing it like on a government level, you know, and you should invest in free software, and like Berlin should do it, Madrid should do it, Barcelona should do it, Paris should do it, and then they have a lot more of like capital.
We are doing it.
I know, it's great, I love it, you know. But Berlin is like doing it like super little, you know, and even the left in Germany is like not really having the topic on its mind, you know, and that is stupid. Just because we are like paying all those like money to like Google and to give us like, I don't know, Google for Office and Facebook for Office and Microsoft computers, and that is just, I don't know, it's so stupid. And then you come and say there's like no alternative. That is like.
But we should lobby, but you know, but the first government you should lobby is the German government, because if there is any government in Europe that has the capacity to shift this, is your government.
Yeah, I know.
And actually, we have the digital commissioner is German. And the only companies that can get their shit
like
together
free software is like
German.
only like an
look, the question was, there is a website where I can go and buy a Linux phone. That was the framing of the question. It was not a debate about what does she do as a government, which, you know, and you're kind of admitting the fact that, you know, the reason why it's happening is not because politicians are stupid, but because lobbyists are clever.
No,
and once you resolve that question in Germany, you'll have everything. It's not like you need to educate your politicians.
Right. Come, you think the politicians...
You're a hard piece of work, this panel.
You do a job as a politician, then when you retire, you make your serious money by working for these corporations and banks. You know, Tony Blair is worth £13.5 million. He didn't get that from his public service. He got that as his reward for the policies he did while he was in office. The people who screwed up the Brexit referendum are now being paid £200,000 per lecture. Right? So this is what you have to understand, is when the politicians are not kept under control, they're the ones who are being the rational, not us. They just think, well, where's the money? Yeah, give over Europe to these corporations and banks, and we'll coin it. So if you want to control the politicians, you need to do something.
We have a question
Expanding on the question of what government should do, it took Soviet space program 4 years to take a man in space, and that was quite complex technical task. Cybernetics is an innovation totally of state making. And also the fact is that there is currently, I was just looking that up, $13 trillion lying in negative yielding bonds. So I think the question is, what has happened that the vision of technological development was fully surrendered to the markets, and can we think of any meaningful strategy of regaining the capacity of commanding that vision going forward, no? Or it's so utterly lost to the scale of financialization, where just Uber is able to get so much more money than any single government, and that's really what's going to happen. And we are facing similar challenges as the Second World War or Cold War back then. Think of climate change. I think that requires both social change and technological transformation at the same level of capacity, and that cannot be weighted out while market figures that out, I think.
Any more questions, or does anyone want to answer here on the panel?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't know. I think the question contained the answer, and I mean, I think, you know, you answer it yourself. I mean, you gave, and I totally agree with that. I see this is the dilemma, no? So this is the dilemma that you would like to revert this kind of, we are saying here you need emission-oriented investment in order to boost innovation that is green, that solve climate change, that is more egalitarian, I mean all of that. But the thing is that this system is broke that should provide that, and so I mean you said it yourself. It's there is no. I mean at this point, it's hard to see a kind of really shift in that. I mean, the shift that we need in that.
So just quickly, I have a Polish friend, and he said that living now for him was like living in Poland in the 1980s, where they knew the old system was finished, but they just didn't know what was going to come next. And he said that he feels very much in a similar situation. Is in a sense we know that this model doesn't work. I mean, just some really basic things that you said, like climate change, but just a social, economic level. As we have, you said there actually is not. Probably we have already the tendency rate of profit has got when they start giving away money to banks to just keep the value, some value. So we know that it's broken. It's just that we need to have some form of collective vision of what the next stage is. And the advantage the Chinese have is not the, what are the current system of government, but if you speak to Chinese, they have a long view of history. They think of thousands, and they think 50 years ahead. They might be the wrong plan for 50 years ahead, but at least they think ahead. And whereas our system can't think beyond next week or the next quarter or at most the next election. And we are in a real problem until we have a vision of what we want to actually do and organise it. The abilities are there. We've got the technology, we have the people, we just haven't got the self-organisational capacity to make a better world. And it can easily, it's said some of the problems we've solved in the past, we can do it. We just need the confidence to be able to actually go ahead and put these good ideas into practice.
I just want to say something very brief. So I think on the purely intellectual level, I think it will actually become only tougher to argue that you need a different model from the current neoliberal one, because I mean, the kind of hegemonic push that comes from Silicon Valley is through various think tanks, thinkers close to it, conferences, you name it, is immense, and the goal of it is precisely to convince us that the internet started working well only once it was privatized in 1995. And the entire narrative revolves around that. It's the idea that all of the big things happened once the government kind of left it alone and the private innovation took off. And we actually argue that with AI, you'll hear that argument more and more often. I myself have made this kind of comparison. I don't think it's inaccurate, which is to say that online advertising has been something of a privatized Manhattan Project for artificial intelligence. I mean, ultimately, this is what has developed AI as it is, particularly in the form of, deep learning as it exists now, with users, basically teaching the systems through their actions underwritten by advertising. This is what has given us that system. Of course, you can say it builds on, 40 years of work on neural nets and, funding by the Defense Department and so forth. It will be very difficult to provide a counter history that will actually situate. I'm not even sure we'd be able to provide it. Then you'll have to actually look and show the actual consequences of that model of innovation. Because ultimately, if this is provided by the market and by the private sector, then it's the rentiers running the show and keeping all the spoils for themselves. So I might actually think we would be better off just looking at it sociologically in terms of its consequences politically, rather than trying to historically argue that this is not how things have been traditionally.
No, but sorry, I mean, isn't the alternative the way, now, okay, my Eurocentrism here, but I mean, the way that we've been running hospitals, schools, and do like science, and have railways that actually work and not like in America, and have hospitals that actually work and not like in America. I mean, isn't this like how we actually supposed to build these things? Because it seems that everything was invented in Silicon Valley, and the only way to make it is sell advertising and surveil people. But actually, this is not the world that we're living in. Doesn't operate in this way.
No, I know. It just will be very hard to sell the idea that Europe innovates. It will be very hard. Despite Horizon 2020 and massive billions that go into European funding, it will be very hard to take the welfare state and its fruits, which are fantastic, and argue that that model fosters Elon Musk's. It will be very hard to do that. Not that I'd be happy if Elon Musk, goes on his rocket to Mars, but it just will be very hard to do that in the public debate.
I guess we're getting to the end, so time for a beer. This is not my question, but I just want to say that I think Mariana Mazzucato has a lot to say about what you're talking about, and she shows quite clearly that actually almost every technological innovation has been publicly funded and doesn't come from Silicon Valley. But I still wanted to circle back to political strategy, because even if we say that the cargo cult, Uber imitation co-op that's just taking Silicon Valley platform capitalist models and making them cooperative or making them free software, that this is kind of a going nowhere idea. I agree with you on that. But the GDR had a great phrase, Oberholen ohne einzuholen, which means surpass without overtaking. And so that just because we can't imitate Silicon Valley doesn't mean that there are other approaches are possible, like public transit as opposed to self-driving cars, like public housing as opposed to Airbnb. There's other approaches that we can take where the local can play a role. And I also still want a clearer answer on the rent capturing assets, because surely real estate, intellectual property, and data are different and have different economics, but their economic relationship to all of us is the same. It's a rental relationship. And pardon?
No.
This debate really has to go in a beer.
No, I know
this is really the beer.
Pardon?
This is over a beer.
Okay. Well, we can talk about that later. But to the degree that
It's monopoly. It's monopoly property.
He's a Sweezian. I didn't take you for a Sweezian. Are we calling for public control of all rent capturing assets or not? Can we make a clear political statement?
You want to solve everything, including real estate, not just data tonight.
Well, I'm saying that can we just have a partial solution? Like if we only solve part of the solution. I mean, the thing about rent is that it draws value from other capitals, right? That's the thing about rent. And so if you just only eliminate one parts of the rent, won't just other parts of the rent draw that value away? Will we really solve the problem? Do we really care which capitalists and which rentiers capture the value, or do we want them to not capture the value?
Well, the French bourgeoisie solution was to guillotine the rentiers. That's one solution.
No, I mean, I don't know if there are other questions. Let's take other questions. If not,
I would just
he
has actually two questions. I just want to make a very basic point, which looks a little bit your social democratic point. You will love it. No, meaning that I think, also when we talk about evolution to some alternatives or transition and all of that, I mean, like speaking from my personal, the job that I have now, clearly we're doing this through the public institution. We're using the state, we're using the public institution, and this means that we have to start working with the companies as well. For instance, when I said this debate has to happen in Germany, I'm serious. And it is not true that all the interests of all the German companies, like a company like Bosch, that make things, why would the interest be not much more aligned with the vision that we're expressing here? That it doesn't, that for them it is a problem that Google, it's like taking all the data, and it is a problem, even from their kind of, positioning. So we have to start, I think, aligning a much bigger, bigger alliances here. We cannot only think, it's only us and it's the left and we don't know what it is. Is it marginal or not? No, it's a social majority, and we have a broad alliance, I think, because many companies, many governments are not happy with what is happening.
Okay, I would suggest let's have one or two more questions, then I'm going to give the panel the opportunity to make a final statement. Okay, you first.
Well, there already is alternatives, which is like the Ethereum network, which people are able to put software on, and then you go on the network and you'll be able to pay micropayments to use that software. And there's a Scottish company called MaidSafe, which are building a decentralized internet. So now that Trump's in power, a lot more people might want to use that and keep their privacy. And you can also use share files. And as for Uber, Uber is using local people, and I think there will be a free version of Uber within a year or two, and I bet anyone at Bitcoin there will. There will be a version of Uber where there isn't a company. It will be decentralized, and there isn't a company profiting of it. And Airbnb.
Before you have to wear an advert.
There's a question over here, and then
yes. Does this go? What we saw in the last 15 years, and we saw a slower. People called it the time of slower innovations. The big things were invented in the decenniums before this. In the last 16 years, there didn't happen so much. Basically, may there be a connection between this monopolization of this industry in Silicon Valley? And second, how do you see the opposition of national, getting back to national building frontiers like Trump? Doesn't he oppose his own this Silicon Valley world, or isn't there an opposition against this? Or how do you see this Trump effects? These Trump effects.
Do you want to?
Sure. Okay. Well, since we're making closing remarks, right? So I can say. No, I'll talk about Trump for sure. It's easy. But before I get into that, let me just float one idea tied to one particular critique. I mean, it's true that when Richard says that there is no austerity, I mean, on some level, it's correct. I mean, it is a lie one way or another. Fantastic. But if you look at it from the perspective of a city that's broke and does not receive federal funding, what do you do in these conditions, right? I mean, your options are basically very few. You go to the capital markets and you issue bonds, right? I mean, that's what cities do, and this is how they finance infrastructure development and a lot of other things. And you all know what the problem with that is, because every time you do something radical in your city, and you need to go back to the capital markets in order to raise money for bonds, you have to be rated by a credit rating agency like Moody's and the Standard & Poor's and so forth, which basically means that every single city is terrified of doing anything that might alienate capital markets. Thus, they don't do anything radical. Thus, they never build anything because they can never actually borrow the money to push for the kind of innovative policy that we would actually like, ambitious, big, blah, blah. Which means that, of course, we have to be thinking about how to solve that issue if you really want to see some radical innovation happen at the city level. Which means that, A, we need alternative institutions of actually assessing what's happening in the city, how credit-worthy that is, and how it actually reflects the fiscal health, if you want, of a city, that will not be tied to the rating agencies. And you can think, I think, if you are a techie very productively, how some of that can happen on the blockchain or elsewhere in a way that would actually create some trust from the market, but would not require some, MBA sitting at Standard & Poor passing judgment on whether, investing in free software is going to undermine your fiscal discipline, right? So you would like to delegate some of those elements to things that are actually technological and can still fake at least some of the trust. And second, you need to find ways to raise money alternatively, right? Which is where alternative instruments of crowdfunding come in. And I actually think that if you manage to solve that problem of basically somehow tying blockchain to an entirely new crowdfunding system where it will not just be crowdfunding with people donating money, but it will actually be cities issuing some kind of mini bonds where we all invest a little bit and we all get some payments down towards the end, maybe with some even combination of welfare benefits and pensions paying for some of it. I think we might actually solve quite a lot, because that will allow us to actually untie our hands and experiment without fearing the punishment of the financial markets, because we can raise money from our citizens on the one hand, and we can bypass the credit rating infrastructure completely. Sorry for this intrusion of reality in my otherwise very abstract talk. So that's one solution. But more broadly, I think my view is very dark. I mean, I think we are moving back to feudalism. So to me, it's obvious you will have rentiers, and I know Richard is now going to pick some theoretical points in this, but I do think you're going to have new types of rentiers extracting new type of rent, and I do think that in that sense, it's not just data actually, Dmitry, I think it's also sensors and basically the entire, and communication. So it's the infrastructure for extracting data that's not just data. I mean, all of that will, in one way or another, be used for extracting rent out of you, in generating rent, right? In that sense, I wish I were as optimistic as Francesca thinking about Bosch, but you know, their model, to me, is quite clear when you look at what they do in the Internet of Things. I mean, they're not Google. They don't really tap into your data because, I mean, maybe they will once you have this, you know, smart, I don't know, irons and whatnot. But at this point, their way to monetize this stuff is to create machines that charge each other, right? So you can actually basically charge people for using things. I mean, it's amazing what you will discover if you do enough research on the Internet of Things. You have all these big companies being bought up by Cisco, Siemens, Bosch, and others, which all they do, they find ways to monetize activity and charge for it. You know, like there are startups that will charge you for sitting for 5 seconds on a sofa. And that will differ from somebody who sits on it for 10 seconds and maybe enjoys it a little bit more, because now you can also measure emotional responses. You know, that's not like Philip K. Dick kind of Ubik science fiction. This is like now. It's like they're being bought and billions are being paid for that. So, I mean, I see the point of trying to pit these firms against each other, and clearly German industry has interests different from American industry, and you can maybe generate something out of it. I wouldn't necessarily think that somehow they represent some kind of nicer form of capitalism. I mean, at this point, as long as Google offers you things for free, as opposed to Bosch charging you for sitting on the sofa, I think most people would actually prefer Google.
No, I mean...
It's not a compliment to Google, it's just a statement.
No, the dystopic view is always kind of fits reality better. No, I think there is a basic point on what I was trying to say, that, you know, we have been funding these infrastructures. I mean, really, honestly, I don't know your research. I mean, you do a lot of research. This also should be in your research. I mean, it has been said before. This was funded with public money. We already paid for it. So now we have to get these companies to work for us. It's very simple. Well,
yes, I think we pointed that out in the.
I was working for them all the time.
That's what I think. That's what we pointed out in the Californian ideology 20-odd years ago. Yeah, you know, the internet was created by the state. It's a state project. The capitalists were the last people on. You know, it was first the state, then the hobbyists, and then finally the capitalists. So this story is just wrong, actually. I always think the trouble is, Evgeny, I think you read all this capitalist hype, and then they produce a shiny version of the future, and you produce the pessimist version of the future. But it's actually the same future, you know, and that's the problem. You see, and it's a very you know, it's a standard left academic position. Everything's terrible, and it's all going to get worse, and aren't we miserable? Blah 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 blah. And what it does is it demobilises people, and it's a very serious. And unless we say, no, we've won. You know, we won. You know, in my lifetime, Stalinism finished. Apartheid was abolished. We have gay marriage in our country. You know, there's all these sorts of things. So we've won victories. So unless we keep saying we've done it, and we got Jeremy Corbyn elected not once but twice, yeah. So unless you give people some optimism and encouragement, and rather than saying we're all going to be dominated by these morons in Silicon Valley, you know, you essentially defeated before you even started. As I said, I'm a gamer, so one thing we always like to do, one thing you always do in a game is, even in the most hopeless situation, you keep saying, I'm about to win. I think actually our position is actually much, much stronger than you think, precisely because I think that, you know, to use the old Marxist thing, you know, the forces of production are being hampered by the relations of production. And not necessarily we'll go into cybernetic communism or something, but it's actually the neoliberal paradigm of this stage of capitalism is now limiting the possibilities of this technology and the social relations of production and sociability and culture around it. So that means that we are on a stage where there could be a break with this. What comes out the other end is that we have to contribute to that. Because it could, you know, Fordism collapsed and we got neoliberalism. Stalinism collapsed in Eastern Europe and they got neoliberalism. If neoliberalism goes down, yeah, we could end up with a sort of, you know, sort of fascism. I mean, Yugoslavia being the example. Look at, and I always thought Slobodan Milosevic was supposed to be like a reversion to the past, but actually he seems like a horrible prescient of the future. So that could be a possibility, but if we don't put forward a positive, democratic, egalitarian, ecological solution, yeah, to use your word you hate, practical ways of improving people's lives, we're being negligent and we're being foolish because we do know what's going on. We have the ability to make a better world. Let's go ahead and do it.
Actually, to be nice with Evgeny, I mean, no, just to give to Evgeny what I think this local bond on the blockchain, I mean, I put it down, I think it's, you were in your super positive moment, and I think it's a great idea. I wrote it down, and actually we're gonna have to do it. I mean, this was a great idea.
I mean, look.
Brilliant.
No, but Richard, but
like a great idea.
I think the problem is that the amount of self-criticism in the digital community is non-existent, right? And this is the problem that I have. Because, guys, you've lost it. You've been in it for 20 years. Like, all the fights that have been lost against Google, Amazon, Facebook, it's the fault of you guys, because you thought you were winning. I think you have to acknowledge that. Like, you have to acknowledge that, rethink all the mistakes that were made, and just say that we screwed up, we underestimated the challenge, we underestimated that these companies will be running countries, and we have overestimated solutions like cooperativism. I think there is nothing wrong in acknowledging that mistake. You know, I wasn't around in the 90s. I didn't make those predictions. I didn't make those arguments. But like, you have to have some self-criticism.
It's not.
We were pros right on everything in the Californian ideology. What are you talking about? Let's go have a beer.
I'd like to summarize this great conference in one sentence, which would be, let's create a technocratic populism from the left in order to achieve small irreversible changes in building the cooperative Commonwealth. Thank you all very much. Thank you for this vivid panel. And yeah, let's have a drink.